Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Tyler Take. I haven't uploaded in a little while, but I figured I'd take some time to sit down with y'all today. I got some great questions from you guys. Yeah, sorry, I don't actually have I don't have a tripod here because I'm just like at home and doing this in a very informal way. I got some questions from you guys, and I figured I'd try to answer them in my own way. Uh, Essentially, I think it would be important to address how I've changed living abroad. So, living abroad changes you in so many ways. I don't even know where to start with this. Um, I've been in Korea for almost 15 years now, I guess. I came here in 2011. So everything has changed, right? Like the world has changed. Y'all have changed. I have changed. Everybody's changed in 15 years. There's no way that that doesn't happen. And honestly, thinking about how living in Korea has changed me is a really hard question to answer because I just don't really remember everything about who I was before then. Like, how are you going to remember all of that? It's not like I was journaling every day or something. Uh, but it is possible to sort of think about some things that really do stand out for me. Of course, there are tons of small things. You know, everybody has that. You know, the things that you like to eat, the music that you listen to, the friends that you have. All of these things obviously change. But there are some really, really, really big fundamental things about who you are as a person that definitely change when you live abroad, and there's no way you can avoid it. And the longer you live abroad, the more that happens to you. So I want to address what those three things are for me. I'm sure other people have different experiences, but I have an inkling that many other Americans, at least, who have been living abroad for the past few years, may have had similar experiences to me. So personally, you know, the first thing is I think I've really become what do we call that? A no-sayer? Naysayer? Like, I don't know. Yeah, the opposite of a yes man. I've become someone who loves to say no. And I've always been an opinionated person. I think everybody who knows me directly understands that. I have extremely strong opinions. Um, but I did grow up in a place. I grew up in Vermont, right? It's a place where it's like small town, not a lot of people. And when I say small town, it's not really even like most people don't live in a town. They live in an administrative area that is referred to as a town, just like counties are counties and cities are cities. But it's not really a town in the sense that there's people who like live in a neighborhood, right? You walk out the door and you're gonna have to walk a ways to get to somebody's house. And then maybe if you want to go to school, it's going to take you, you know, 20 to 40 minutes, depending on where that is. You want to pick up a gallon of milk or whatever, that's going to take you another 45 minutes or whatever. So it's a very small place, and you always run into people who just like living in Vermont. You know, I guess it's really different for other people in the United States as well. I grew up understanding the beeping of a car horn as saying hello. That is my fundamental understanding in my body. My reaction to a beep of a car horn was originally look up and maybe wave to say hi. And I figured out moving into Chicago that when you're crossing the street and someone beeps at you, it's get the hell out of the way. It's not, oh hey, I know who you are. How's it going? So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, I grew up in a small community, right? And when you grow up in a community like that, even if there's things you don't agree with, there are certain ways to go about it. You don't just say, no, I don't like that. I'm not going to do that. That is not what I believe in. Move on. You don't have this kind of direct way of communication. It's kind of, well, I don't know. I guess we could do that, but what about XYZ? It's very, you know, beating around the bush because you never know who you're going to run into and who you're going to depend on. There's a lot of sort of indirectness to the culture, and that's just how it is. I'm sure that's how I would become if I were to go back there again and live for an extended period of time today. You never know, you know, who you're going to wind up knowing. You even say hello to people that you don't know, and that culture I think you find a lot throughout different parts of America. But moving to Korea, that is not very applicable. I think if you were to move to the countryside in Korea, maybe that would work. But for those of you who don't know, the Korean countryside is pretty much emptying out. Very few people live there. The average age of people who live in the countryside is extremely high. I live in an extremely highly populated area of a city with like 15 million people that can even go up to higher numbers during the day of the weekdays, right? It's just such a massive city, essentially. And if you move to a place like Seoul, you're going to change in tons of ways. But when you move to another country, something happens where you need to adapt. You have to localize. And if you're not going to be there for very long, it doesn't really matter, so you don't have to localize, right? But if you're going to be there for, a year or 4 years or however many years you think it might be, you wind up approaching the locality in a way where you sort of you let go of what you think right and wrong is. Because you walk into the room saying, hey, okay, I need to adapt here. Things are different here. The way that I work is probably not going to be the way that people here work. How can I fit in and integrate myself? So then what happens is your brain tends to just say, accept the culture, period, end of story. It's like dogma, right? Like we don't know why things are the way they are yet. So just take them for what they are and adapt and when in Rome, right? Just like follow what everybody else does. So that's stage one. But then you hit stage two where experiences happen to you and you're like, oh, well, wait, why is this happening? Why? I don't get it. What is going on here? And just moments where you start to question that. And that brings you to stage three in your experience, which is like crisis mode. Because you originally walked into this experience saying, hey, I'm going to accept everything. I'm going to try to adapt locally. I'm going to try to be one of the people here. And you accept everything, but then once you start questioning and you don't get the answers that you want, or you realize that you're maybe not okay with some of the things that are going on, all of a sudden you run into crisis mode, because the whole point of you doing everything that you've done up to this point was to integrate and to fit in and to accept. But now things are happening in your brain that are, like warning signs are going off, and you're like, wait, is this right? Does this mean I need to leave? Does this mean it's not okay for me to be here if I don't accept all of this? Is this like, am I allowed to like not agree? And all of a sudden, self-crisis mode sort of starts to happen. But what that does, I think it's a really, really good thing, because it pushes you into stage four, which is to discover what your own values actually are. So when you're uplifted from one culture and you're put into another, and you get through that accepting period and that questioning period and you hit the crisis, it pushes you to force yourself to ask, okay, well then, no matter what culture is, what do I think? What do I believe? What are my values? What do I care about? And what do I want in my life? And then that brings you to the final stage, which is the identification and defense of your values and what you believe in. And it sort of hardens you in a way. It's like, now I'm not going to accept everything, and no matter what other people think about that and whether or not I fit in, that doesn't matter, because I know which things I agree with and I don't agree with. I know what's okay and not okay for me, and then you start to stick to it. So that brings you to a point where instead of saying yes to everything, all of a sudden you have something to defend. Now all of a sudden you're going against the grain. And then, well, how do you do that? How do you convince other people that something is okay? Is it really something you need to convince them about, or can you just do it anyways because it's what you see as important to your life and to who you are? Well, you just gotta, at the end of the day, defend your values, stick to your guns, and you wind up saying no to a lot of things. And you wind up saying, it's okay if other people don't like me. It's okay if other people think I'm a jerk because I don't accept this aspect of a culture or a practice in a society. So I think that has really brought me to a point where I've become a really assertive person in what I think is right and wrong. I know this is not providing you with any specific details, and it's really hard to provide you with specific details because this is sort of a philosophical thing that happens to you when you change from one culture to the other. All of a sudden, the focus becomes on what do you really think, because you have to choose, right? Um, you know what? Like, there are things from your original culture that you want to keep and you think are better, and there are things from the new culture that you want to take and adapt and have, but then there are other things that you think are not okay and you want to reject. Uh, and if you don't give yourself the ability to make that choice, then it's really hard to be a full person. And so, what happens is you become assertive, you learn to say no, and maybe it's important for me at this point to learn to say no in a nicer way. But other than that, yeah, I think I've really switched to being a much more assertive and grounded person by fundamentally switching the culture that I live in. So the second big thing that changes for you when you live abroad is related. Actually, it's really related to the first one. Um, I don't know how to put this in a way that is palatable for many people nowadays in the United States, because I think that there's a huge conversation going on in the US about identity. What is America? Who are Americans? Uh, how do we relate to each other even though we're different? This is becoming I guess, a topic with a lot of question marks for Americans. And in this situation, of course, it becomes political at some point. In this situation, people tend to have, or one of two ways of approaching differences. And those, in my mind, are cultural relativism and utilitarianism. Uh, so when someone has a different culture than you, uh, in America, I think we're pretty much taught to say, respect other cultures. Um, you don't know what that is. Maybe it has its own thing. You don't want to judge. Don't pass judgment on other cultures, because when Western societies have done this in the past, it has brought up many problems. And then people start to talk about all the difficulties and issues that have arisen uh, in the United States or European countries or other parts of North America that are related to the idea that one culture might have something better than another culture. We're taught and we're raised and we're socialized in the United States in a way to sort of put some distance there. We don't necessarily want to pass too much judgment, and I don't think that that is 100% um, because of some sort of external political influence. I don't think it's because of, um, gosh, something that's too cultural. I think it's just like part of who Americans are, because we're all so different, right? You know, like Vermonters have their own state with their own laws and their own view of the world, and New Yorkers have a very different uh, state and laws and view of the world, just as would people from South Carolina or North Dakota or whatever. And even if we walk into the room with these people and we understand ourselves as both Americans, we might have very clashing opinions about each other's systems, but at the end of the day, it's a separate system, right? So we kind of are taught that although there are other people who live in different ways, and we're not going to be too aggressive or judgmental about those places, because those places have their own right to exist in that way, right? So we're sort of like grown up in this environment structurally, and then on top of this, you throw in, you know, multiculturalism, diversity, immigration, blah blah blah, and it just sort of grows from there. So I think cultural relativism is something that's very easy to fall into in the United States, just because it's such a diverse place. And in order for people to get along, the easiest thing to do is say, let's just not judge each other, and let's not have opinions on what is better. Let's just say, okay, agree to disagree, move on. And that sort of puts us in this position where it's easy to avoid making a judgment. But the other perspective would be a more utilitarian perspective, right? So, like, oh, culture isn't something that is somehow holy or uh, sanct in a way where it needs to be respected just because it is culture, right? Utilitarian perspective would be like, oh, well, is it important to do what your parents say all the time just because they're parents? Say the culture says that that's what you have to do. Well, then a utilitarian perspective would look at that and say, okay, well, maybe that's not a good thing because the parents are the older people are telling younger people what to do in a world that has fundamentally changed, and the things that the older people think work actually don't work. So the cultural value of saying respect your elders, listen to your elders, do what they say, actually in real life, when it becomes not a theory but a practice, can actually disenfranchise young people and put them in a situation where they're not able to control their own lives. They can't find a home. They become depressed and suicide rates go up, right? Like there's actually real life implications for the cultures that we choose to keep, right? So uh, basically what I'm trying to say is when you switch from one culture to another culture, you have more than one software that you can choose to use, right? And you're naturally put in a situation where you have to make a choice between one and the other. But what happens is if you're approaching the world in a way where you're a cultural relativist and you're saying, well, all cultures are equal and all values need to be judged within the parameters of that culture, then all of a sudden what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to make a decision. You're not going to be able to get through your identity crisis. You're not going to be able to define who you are as an individual. All of a sudden you'll be lost. And of course, it's not a black and white world. You can have one value at one time and switch to another at another time. That's totally okay. But you need to have a parameter for that, right? Like the why of what you're doing becomes really important. And if the only solution for making that choice for you is all cultures are equal and all cultural practices therefore need to be respected in exactly the same way, then it's really hard for you to actually justify a choice or an opinion about what to do with your own life in that situation. So you sort of naturally become more utilitarian. You naturally say, oh, well, no, not all cultures are equal. Why, like, it just becomes something that you're naturally presented with. It would be really great if I could give you a perfect example of what this feels like. Um, but it's really, really hard to think of. At the end of the day, it makes you realize that culture is not some sort of lofty thing that is somehow sacrosanct or traditional or needs to be respected, period, end of story. You realize that culture is actually more like a piece of software, right? It needs updates. There are times when a culture just being respected no matter what doesn't fit the reality of the world that we live in. And if that is true, if we know that that is true, then we have to admit that not every aspect of every culture can automatically be equal and respected because there's a functionality to it, right? Um, yeah, so this is something that has happened to me. I grew up thinking we just have to respect all cultures no matter what, all their practices, they're okay in the relative context of what that culture is. But at the end of the day, when you're living your life, like that's a really nice idea. It's a beautiful idea. That's great. But when you're living your life and you're going between more than one culture and you're dealing with more than one culture, at the end of the day, you have to make a choice and you need a basis for choosing. And the difference between theory and practice hits you in the face. And what you need is some sort of more moral, personal guide towards how you navigate the world. So for me, living in Korea for a long time, has really removed my cultural relativist perspective of the world and replaced it with something extremely utilitarian. Um, the third major change, I think, that has happened to me as a human being, living in Korea for so long, has been that I have just gotten a whole new perspective on what America is. Uh, and it's a really weird experience because, I mean, if any of you have immigrant relatives or know friends who have immigrant backgrounds within maybe one or two generations of that individual, then you'll probably know that that culture of that migrated family becomes sort of like a time capsule. It's like frozen in time. Um, for example, like my family, right? My father's family is from Austria, but they're definitely not from the European Union Austria of today, right? Like, not at all. Like, there's zero, like, actual identity relevance there. Uh, the Austrian culture of that aspect of my family comes from the 1960s. Everything up until the 1960s, okay, there's matching there, but everything from that point, there's a massive disconnection. None of the experience after the 1960s that is Austria, we're talking how many years? It's like another 60 years, right? Like none of that 60 years of change has really had a large impact on the identities and cultures practiced in that aspect of my family, right? So this happens to anybody who goes from one culture to another culture and stays there for a long time and moves where their root is. It's what happens to everybody. So for me, I've been in South Korea for 15 years. So here's some things that I did not experience in America that maybe some of you who are watching this have experienced. I left in 2011. So even though I'm tuned into the news and content and friends and family, and I do go back on occasion, because I don't live there and I'm not a functional member of society who goes to work and meets up with friends at happy hour and, goes out on the weekend or whatever, I am not steeped in the context and the changes that are happening in America. I'm viewing it from a completely different outsider's perspective, even though I feel a strong connection. So some of the things I didn't experience. I did not experience the second Obama administration. I did not experience the first Trump administration. I did not experience the Biden administration, and I'm not experiencing the current Trump administration now. I did not experience COVID. I did not live in America when there were conversations about privilege or wokeism or far right. None of these things were discussed or even present in the minds of Americans when I lived there. I did not experience a fentanyl crisis. I did not even experience the rise of social media in America. I got my first smartphone, like one that has a big screen on it, right? I got my first smartphone, like not a flip phone, when I moved to South Korea. So Instagram, Facebook, whatever apps we're talking about, the ways that people pay with, what is it, like Venmo or whatever, when the ways that you use your banking apps today, or the crypto changes, or like all of this, right? I never experienced that in America. So on top of that, you throw on all of the bands and music and trends and changes in vernacular. When people started using the word ratchet, I had no idea what the hell they were talking about. Like, these kind of things, I did not experience or necessarily relate to in the same way that other Americans do, because I'm living in a different context. So what happens is, you just become sort of frozen in time. The memories that you have and the feelings that you have and the things that you sort of maintain as the picture of what America looks like, feels like, tastes like, smells like, etc. All of that is sort of just a time capsule. Uh, and what happens then is then you go back on occasion, or you wind up in a phone call with a family member, and their perspective has changed. Of course, mine has, in a way, a different way, but their perspective in an American context will have changed way more, or developed, I should say, way more than mine, because they're living in that context. And me, I'm sort of just looking at it on occasion. So you'll go there and then you'll see, I don't know, everybody looking at their smartphones in a different way that they never used to. You'll see new immigrant communities that did not exist before. Um, you'll see all this social and demographic change in ways that it's like a different place. It's like all of a sudden, if you were to jump in a time machine and go to America in 2035 or 2040, that's 15 years from now, right? If you were to go to America of 2040 and look at it and be like, oh, wow, I kind of get it, but I kind of don't. That's what I'm experiencing with America. And so it's this weird reverse culture shock that happens to you, I guess. But the thing about reverse culture shock that I want to sort of clarify is culture shock and reverse culture shock are not the same thing. Maybe we think of it that way in terms of the vocabulary, but when we actually experience it, they're no way similar at all. you know? So culture shock is something that happens when everything is new to you, right? You're just thrown into like the deep end of some new ocean and you've never swam in before, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, this is a completely different world. Everything's shocking. I've never seen that fish before. I've never seen such salty water before. I didn't know boots could look like that. Like all this kind of stuff that's like fundamentally different to you. Everything you look at is like, wow, 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 and it gives you culture shock. But reverse culture shock doesn't work that way because with culture shock, both the hardware and the software is new to you. But with reverse culture shock, the hardware is the same, but the software has gotten a massive update that you just don't know how to use it, right? So imagine, you're using your phone, right? And then you don't update your phone for 5 years, and then all of a sudden you do. It's like, oh wait, where did that go? Does that function not exist anymore? Why doesn't it exist anymore? And oh, what happened here? Did they decide to delete it for a reason that I don't get? And like, you can't, it's just like completely, and the shock that you get from that experience is reverse culture shock. You expect familiarity. You expect things to be in a place that they used to be and they're not anymore. But then when you see where they are now, it makes sense, but you kind of don't get it. Maybe all of a sudden you're faced with new questions. And to connect to what we were talking about before with cultural relativism, or being in a situation where you have somewhat of an identity crisis and you have to become more assertive about what your values are because you have to choose what you agree with and you don't agree with. This happens in reverse culture shock as well, but vis-a-vis the things that you used to be so familiar with, right? So all of a sudden you find yourself asking yourself, do I agree with that? Like people who have stayed, they've lived through the conversations, social conversations and experiences that create eventually their decisions. If you've been living in America for the past 15 years, you've experienced the degree to which everybody looks at their phones all the time, and you've experienced COVID, you've experienced conversations, many probably uncomfortable ones, about identity and politics, and you've seen probably first-handed what the drug problem looks like, or you've been through all of that. So all these minor experiences that you've had have stacked up to form your perspective, and you have tons and tons of conversations and arguments and moments that have formulated what you believe and what your opinion is, and that has evolved very naturally for you. But for me, that's not the case. For me, I'm confronted with that all of a sudden, and then how do I deal with that? Well, I haven't had the time, or the I would venture to even say the word luxury, to take the time to think about what I feel about that, or to adjust, or to feel it out. I haven't had that social support from the people that I know, or my friends or family or coworkers or acquaintances or strangers down the street, to give me social cues about how I could think about this. I don't have that. What I have, the only thing that I have in this reverse culture shock moment where you're confronted with a new concept or an idea that you're not sure whether or not you agree with because it wasn't there before, is your own set of personal philosophical values about humans and society and the world existence and who you are. That's all you have. So reverse culture shock forces you to confront regularly rifts in very familiar places. Things that used to be almost comforting for you may now actually be no-go zones. And reverse culture shock puts you in a place where you then just have to decide how you're going to deal with that. Yeah, so I guess for me, the third massive change really is a dissociation uh, from any singular nationality. But that's not the result of being some sort of conglomeration of cultures that is like multicultural and absorbs the world. That's not the result. The result is a highly opinionated individual that is actively choosing what they think is right or wrong, and is put in a position where they're forced um, to identify their own morals and values. And ironically, that's an extremely conservative concept, right? It's like to look at the world based on a set of morals and values. Of course, that comes back to who you are as an individual, and being someone who's been transplanted into a different culture, that set of morals and values isn't something you're getting externally, right? That's maybe the unique aspect to it. You're forced to build it yourself. You're forced to be entrepreneurial about the world that you want to live in. And it just changes you that way. You can no longer be a follower. You can no longer conform. You don't have that choice anymore. You have to do it yourself. And so I think overall, to conclude, how has living abroad changed me? How has living in South Korea for 15 years changed who I am? It just makes you feel like you're more in control of your life. I thought it was a great question. How has living in Korea changed who I am? I haven't really had a lot of time to sit down and think about it. But yeah, no, it really has changed me, and I would highly say, overall, yeah, I should probably say what I think about that. It's a good thing. It's not like, oh, this is a problem. It's an extremely good and a very healthy thing. And I think more people need that experience, because we can become extremely pigeonholed or tunnel visioned, not just with the way that we view the world, but when we're in one culture and one society and one way of doing things. Of course, maybe there are times where we really feel a lot of conflict and, oh, I don't know, and stuff like that. But we're not often put in positions where we're forced to choose and identify what we believe in. And I think that that is really what we need as humans. We need we need to be uncomfortable. We need to be in uncomfortable situations in order to really figure out who we are. Pretty intense stuff. I'll try a lighter question next time, but thanks for joining in this time on The Tyler Take. Bye-bye.